So thank you all for coming. Um, and we are joined by Dr. Andrew Knight. I'm sure this is like one of the most exciting talks that we've had, and we've had so much enthusiasm about this. So I'm really looking forward to this. Um, I have to leave right at 10 o'clock, but y'all feel free to continue discussing. If you have questions, please post them in the chat. After the talk, we'll go through the questions. And I have a podcast I have to get to on unusual whales at 10 a.m. So I have to leave. And if you are trying to get CE credit for this, CE credit is only given if you're watching and participating with this lecture live. And the recorded lecture will not get you any CE credit at the moment. Hopefully it will in the future. And in order to ensure that you get credit and a certificate, you have to fill out the course survey that I'll put a link to in the chat towards the end of the lecture. If you have any problems, please email me at info@ourhonor.org. And so, yeah, please feel free to post any questions in the chat. We want to keep these continuing education courses free and accessible to all. And if you are able to donate, please do. We do accept Venmo, and you can Venmo us at Our Honor, or you can go to ourhonor.org/donate. So without further ado, I will introduce Dr. Andrew Knight. He is a veterinary professor of animal welfare affiliated with the Griffith University in Australia and the University of Winchester in the UK. He's an experienced small animal veterinarian. He's also a UK, European, and American veterinary specialist in animal welfare. He has around 150 academic and 80 popular publications and an extensive series of social media videos and several websites, including sustainablepetfood.info, which are on vegan companion animal diets, climate change, and the livestock sector, invasive animal research, educational animal use, humane, clinical, and surgical skills training, and other animal welfare issues. His studies on vegan pet food have been globally reported. He regularly works with animal welfare charities to advocate for animals and is frequently interviewed by the media. And he has received over 20 awards and research grants for his works. So thank you very much, and take it away, Dr. Andrew Knight.
Thank you very much, Crystal. So it's exciting to be talking to you. I've almost never had the chance to present this information to US audiences, and I think this is one of the really hot topics in veterinary medicine today, particularly for those of us who are interested in animal welfare, sustainable living, or plant-based diets. So obviously I'm talking about should cats and dogs go vegan. I have had the chance to research this area largely full-time for the last couple of years. So I'm really excited to have a chance to share with you some of what has been going on. The idea that cats or dogs could be vegan is often seen as outrageous. We often think of them as carnivores. This is not quite true, really, of dogs, at least. Dogs are biologically omnivorous. They evolved from wolves about 20 to 40,000 years ago. The more confident and better-natured wolves started to approach more closely to our hunter-gatherer ancestors, approach around our campfires and start to receive food scraps from us. They started to cooperate and collaborate with our hunting parties. The staple diets of our ancestors were actually starchy cooked root vegetables, along with obviously some meat as well. And the wolf hybrids that had adaptations that enabled them to derive some nutritional benefit from a mixed diet of human food scraps, including lots of carbohydrate-rich material, did better than the wolves who did not have those adaptations, and over time the population changed into domesticated dogs. Cats have had a different role. They have co-evolved with us for around about 8,000 years, and their role has been to really guard our grain stores, our food supplies from rodents. So they've remained very much biologically carnivorous. They do, of course, consume some plant materials, primarily in the gastrointestinal tracts of prey animals that they catch. None of this is very relevant to modern domesticated dogs or cats, who both subsist on a diet of a variety of assorted body parts from animal species they would never naturally have consumed, such as cows, pigs, fish, turkeys, all sorts of animals, with various unnatural additives packaged up into dry kibble or wet formulations and fed at predictable times daily. Of course, this feeding regime is very far removed from any kind of natural feeding regime that an ancestral dog or cat might have followed. Nowadays, we know that people are increasingly considering plant-based lifestyles for themselves for these sorts of reasons. People are more concerned about health and well-being for themselves and also for their companion animals. We know that they're increasingly seen as part of our own families. They are living longer than they used to, and people are wanting better standards of care for them. They're interested in anything that might increase their longevity and their well-being. The environmental impacts of the livestock sector are increasingly of concern to many people. The sector consumes vast amounts of land, water, and produces enormous amounts of greenhouse gases. And I'm going to be giving some really exciting results relating to pet food in this respect later on. We kill around about 80 billion land animals for food each year worldwide. That's about 10 times the human population of the Earth. And about 1 to 3 trillion fish species, or marine animals, I should say. It's more than just fish. So people are increasingly concerned about certainly the ethics of intensive farming systems. We know that about 90% of all farmed animals are intensively farmed, subjected to high stocking densities in relatively small, pretty barren environments with minimal opportunity to exercise highly motivated behavioral needs. This is chronically stressful to these animals. And virtually all animals, regardless of their environment, are then killed at a very premature stage of life. So there are major animal welfare and ethical concerns with this that are increasingly of concern to people. And there is a food justice issue as well. The consumption of grain per capita varies from just under 30 kilogram per person in developing nations, 30 kilograms per year per person, to around about 96 kilograms per person per year in wealthy nations, particularly the US and Canada. And this disparity occurs because in wealthy nations, most of that grain is not directly consumed by people. It's consumed indirectly in the form of livestock produce. And of course, most of that grain does not convert directly into muscle and meat and milk and eggs. It supports the bodily maintenance and growth processes of livestock animals. The process, of course, is very inefficient, a process of producing those usable livestock produce, with most of the consumed grain being lost along the way. So because there's this massive overconsumption of grain in wealthy nations, it drives up the price of grain, meaning that people in developing nations are less able to afford it. And the result of that is that remember, over 800 million people around the world are suffering from hunger and malnutrition. That's 1 in every 9 people on the planet. It's been said that we actually produce enough food to feed double the human population of the Earth, but we would need 7 planet Earths if everybody was to consume the grain-rich diets of the wealthiest 20 nations. So food distribution and food justice is a huge issue created by our heavy footprint of the livestock sector on planet Earth. So because of these sorts of things, people are considering alternatives to traditional meat-based diets. And these are plant-based diets, but also others. With respect to pet food alternatives to conventional meat-based diets are raw meat, insects, cell-based meat products, vegan and vegetarian products, and those based on yeast and fungi. Amongst these options, vegan pet foods are by far the most developed. The vegan pet food market is already very large and growing rapidly. The dog food market alone is worth about $14 billion globally and growing about 7% a year, but not universally. India has a massive potential. It's already the world's most populous nation with more than 1 billion people there. But there's a very strong culture of vegetarianism in India, and there's an enormous potential for the vegan dog food sector to grow there. And you can see the projected growth rates in India. So how many pet guardians would realistically be willing to choose vegan diets? There have been two major surveys that have examined this question. The first was published by Sarah Dodd and colleagues from Guelph Vet School. So Sarah Dodd is a veterinary nutritional specialist and recently completed a PhD on vegan pet food. She's the other main vet to be focusing on this, along with myself. And they published a study in 2019 where they surveyed over 3,000 pet guardians. And the key part was the bit in red, showing that in total, 35% of those who weren't already feeding a plant-based diet, and by that they're referring to vegan in this particular study, weren't already feeding a plant-based diet, indicated interest in doing so. Amongst those who were already vegan themselves, it rose up to 78%. Now, in 2020, I conducted an even larger survey of over 4,000 guardians, and these were primarily UK European. And I asked what proportion would realistically be willing to choose alternatives to conventional raw meat, so would be willing to choose a plant-based diet, but also other options too, such as cell-based meat, yeast and fungi, and so on. And I found 54% would not be willing to consider alternatives, but 46% would be. So recall, Dodd and colleagues found 35%. We found 46% would be willing to consider plant-based, plus some other alternatives. You can see them there: cell-based meat, insect-based fungi, and so on. So that gives you an idea of what the market would have been in 2019 to 2020, before all of this new evidence became available. I also asked the pet guardians what were the top characteristics that these alternative diets would need to provide before people would realistically be willing to choose them. And there were a long list of these, of which the top 5 were these ones here. Pet health, they needed to be reassured about health outcomes, about the nutritional soundness and quality of the diets, about their palatability, and about their environmental sustainability. And interestingly, price didn't come in the top 5. It came in as number 6 on the list. These results broadly match those that were found by Dodd and colleagues, and also some smaller studies prior to those. So my research since then, since we did a study in 2020, has actually been targeting each of these 5 areas. I'm going to start to run through these now and show you what the evidence currently is about results in these various areas. With respect to the first one, pet health outcomes, the first study that I did in this area was with a PhD student of mine back in 2016. And what we did was we surveyed the literature to find the 4 existing studies that had looked at nutritional soundness of vegan and vegetarian pet food and health outcomes of animals at that time, back in 2016. And this study has been viewed more than 120,000 times, I think, just demonstrating the huge level of interest in this field. It's available free on the internet, open access. The essential conclusion was this: both dogs and cats may thrive on vegetarian diets, and this is also true of vegan diets, of course, but they must be nutritionally complete and reasonably balanced. For anyone not absolutely clear about it, then vegetarian is purely plant-based, whereas, vegan is purely plant-based, but vegetarian may also include dairy milk or eggs. So I'm really focusing nowadays on vegan diets only. There was not too much that happened until this first really large-scale study of health outcomes was published by Dodd and colleagues from Guelph Vet School in 2021. And this was the first very large-scale study of health outcomes, and it was very exciting. They looked at health outcomes that were reported in over 1,000 cats. And the key results are those, again, in the red box. They found that the cats on the plant-based diets, and again, that was the terminology that they use for vegan diets, the cats on the vegan diets had fewer gastrointestinal and hepatic disorders, had more ideal body condition scores, and of course that usually means they're less likely to be overweight and obese, and they were more likely to be reported in very good health. But in all other respects, there were no statistically significant differences between the cats fed meat-based diets and those fed vegan diets. I'm just seeing a question pop up in the chat. I guess probably I will come back to those at the end if that's all right. Dodd and colleagues also looked at the longevity of previously owned cats, and you can see the lifespan curves there. The cats that were being fed plant-based diets had the lifespans in green, and they appeared to be living longer than cats that were fed meat or mixed diets. In this case, the difference, however, was not statistically significant. The next really large-scale study to be published was this one, when colleagues and myself looked at more than 2,500 dogs fed 3 main diets. You can see them there: conventional meat, raw meat, and vegan diets. So as you can see, these are really large-scale studies. What I looked at was I surveyed pet guardians, and I asked people in the last year how many times had their animal needed to visit a vet. Was it just 0 or once, or was it multiple times in the last year, which might have been indicative of treatment for an ongoing healthcare problem? Did they need to receive any kind of medication or not, with the exception of routine preventative flea and worm treatment and neutering operation, analgesia, and so on? Did they have to progress onto a medical diet of some kind after initially being on a vegan diet or some other kind of diet? For those that had seen a vet recently within the last year and felt certain about the vet's healthcare assessment, what was that assessment about the health of their animals? I also gave people the opportunity to report their own opinion, with the hope that this would make them more likely to accurately report the vet's assessment if they disagreed with the vet's assessment. I asked what proportion of animals were unwell, or indeed I calculated that based on reported veterinary assessment of health outcome. For those animals that were unwell, did they suffer from just one health disorder, or were there more than one health disorders? What was the average number per sick animal? And for the 22 most common health disorders in dogs, what was the prevalence of those amongst the 3 different dietary groups? You can see the percentage of animals that were unwell in the 3 different dietary groups was there: 49% for those fed conventional meat, 43% for raw meat, and 36% fed vegan diets. The average cases of health disorder per unwell animal were about 1.65 for conventional meat dogs and about 1.5 for the other 2 groups. The 22 most common health disorders in these 2,500 dogs were these: gastrointestinal was most common, followed by skin coat, other musculoskeletal, and so on. The probabilities of suffering from these 22 health disorders were most common for 11 of the disorders when dogs were fed conventional meat, most common for 8 of the disorders when dogs were fed raw meat, and most common for 3 of the disorders when dogs were fed vegan diets. We also considered dietary hazards in the sense that there is a considerable body of studies that have looked at raw meat diets and noted 2 groups of dietary hazards. One relates to nutritional deficiencies and imbalances, and there tend to be deficiencies in certain vitamins and also minerals and imbalances in those. The other problem relates to pathogens. There is quite a lot of studies showing that dogs fed raw meat have higher rates of infestation and infection with bacterial and non-bacterial pathogens. And unfortunately, so do the people sharing households with those dogs. So they're clearly acquiring those bacterial and other pathogens from the raw meat as they're preparing them for their dogs, or else they're picking them up directly from their dogs. So raw meat diets also have significant dietary hazards, which are lacking in the other 2 groups. They did seem to have better health outcomes than those for dogs fed conventional meat. Once we looked at all of this, it was clear that the healthiest diets with the least hazards were the nutritionally sound vegan diets. We published that study open access in the scientific journal PLOS One last year. That has attracted global media coverage, been reported in New Scientist and so on. Very, very interesting results, and it's fully open access and available to view online. After that, we went further. I then collaborated with some statisticians, and we created regression models to control for differences in dietary groups in age, sex, neutering status, breed size, and exercise level. And once we'd done that, we were able to calculate the reductions in the odds of the indicators of illness occurring for dogs that were not fed conventional meat. The 7 illness indicators are across the x-axis here, so increased numbers of vet visits, medication use, having to progress onto a therapeutic diet, and so on, all 7 across the x-axis. The dashed horizontal line indicates the odds of these outcomes occurring for dogs fed conventional meat. The orange dots indicate the reduction in odds for dogs fed raw meat. And as you can see, a couple of those have, they're called whiskers, these vertical lines extending from the dots. These represent 95% confidence intervals. And in a couple of cases, they cross the dashed horizontal line, indicating that those results were not statistically significant. But most of the time, the results were statistically significant, actually. So there were significant reductions in the odds of these general indicators of illness for dogs fed raw meat, and also, as you can see, for dogs fed vegan diets as well. We then went further and we calculated the probabilities of all of these indicators of illness occurring for dogs with average characteristics. So that is dogs with average age, sex, neutering status, breed size, and exercise levels. You can see that the occurrence of these 7 general indicators of illness for dogs fed conventional meat is provided in the first column. For dogs fed vegan diets is in the second column. And the final column gives the reductions for dogs fed vegan diets when compared to conventional meat. You can see that the reduction in risk of these indicators of illness varied from around about 15% up to about 51% for these 7 general indicators of illness. So there's some really substantial reductions in risk occurring for dogs fed vegan diets. We did the same thing for dogs fed vegan diets compared to raw meat. And as you can see, in most categories, there are also significant reductions in risk, varying from about 8% up to about 34%. In 2 cases, there seemed to be increases in risk, so negative reductions for dogs fed vegan diets. One relates to whether they were likely to have unusually high numbers of veterinary visits, increased veterinary visits. So dogs fed raw meat seem to have lower veterinary visits than dog fed vegan diets. And this could be because they're spectacularly healthy, but we think there's another reason. We think that it's because most veterinarians are quite disapproving of guardian choices to feed raw meat diets. We think that the guardians feeding raw meat diets are well aware of this and are actually becoming more reluctant to visit veterinarians because of this. There's a dramatic reduction in the odds of progressing onto a therapeutic diet for dogs who are fed raw meat. And the simple explanation for that is that there don't seem to be any therapeutic diets which are raw meat-based therapeutic diets. So people committed to feeding raw meat seem to be dramatically less likely to move on to using a therapeutic diet. Interestingly, there are some other aspects in our study that seem to confirm our theory that guardians feeding raw meat were less likely to visit veterinarians and also to generally comply with veterinary advice. One key piece of veterinary advice is usually neutering animals for certain health and benefits and to prevent pet overpopulation as well. The group that was dramatically less likely to be neutered compared to the other groups was the dogs fed raw meat diets. So they seem to be visiting vets less often and also complying with veterinary preventative healthcare advice less than the other groups, and that's probably not all because of supposed health benefits. There's probably cultural reasons explaining these results. We went further and calculated additional regression models to control for differences in age, sex, neutering status, and so on between the different dietary groups, not just for the 7 general illness indicators, which meant 7 regression models, but also for the 22 most common health disorders, which meant another 22 regression models. And after doing that, we were able to calculate the reductions in odds of illnesses, specific illnesses, occurring for dogs fed, say, vegan diets compared to conventional meat-based diets. And those are given by the middle column. And there were 6 cases in which there were statistically significant reductions in odds. And they were pretty big reductions. You can see that they varied from 50% up to about 61% reduction in odds of suffering from those specific healthcare conditions for dogs fed vegan diets. For dogs fed vegan diets compared to raw meat, there were reductions in odds of 2 conditions occurring. That's the right-hand column. There were 2 cases in which vegans seemed more likely to suffer, and it was internal parasites in both cases, if you look at the bottom of the middle and the right-hand column. And we wondered why that might be. And we thought it's probably because people feeding vegan diets are wrongly assuming that because their animals are not consuming any meat, they are not being exposed to any risk of parasites, and perhaps they're not treating for anthelmintics and with other parasiticides as often as they otherwise might do. So clearly animals can pick up parasites from other causes, and appropriate preventative or treatments for parasites continue to be warranted even if animals are being fed vegan pet foods, and perhaps there is a need for an education campaign to ensure that people feeding diets are aware that they still need to consider the risk of parasites. So this study is under review at the moment. This additional follow-on study that has used all the regression models to actually quantify what the risk reductions were for indicators of illness for dogs fed vegan diets. And that should be published in the coming months. Following that, the initial part of our study was published in early 2022. This study was published by Don and colleagues later in 2022, and they looked at more than 1,100 dogs, including nearly 360 fed vegan diets, fed these diets for 3 years on average. Dogs in our study were fed the diets for at least 1 year on average. They found the vegan dogs were more likely to be assessed as being in very good health, less likely to suffer from gastrointestinal and hepatic disorders. Now, that's exactly what they found with the cats, by the way. And then the third benefit seemed to be ocular disorders, and they didn't find that with the cats, so something different. They likewise looked at the lifespan curves of previously owned dogs. There were more than 1,200 previously owned dogs. The vegans, and once again, appeared to be living longer than the dogs fed meat or mixed diets. In this case, unlike the cats, in this case, the difference was statistically significant. So the dogs fed vegan diets were living another 1.5 years longer compared to dogs fed meat-based diets. This is extremely exciting because a rule of thumb sometimes used in veterinary practice is that 1 year of a dog life equates to 7 years of a human life, very roughly speaking. If this were true, then 1.5 years of a dog life would equate to around about an extra decade of human lifespan. And imagine what that would mean to us if we had that available, or that was available to our loved ones toward the end of their lives. And of course, not only are these dogs living longer, they seem to be living better as well. They seem to have better quality of lives because they seem to be suffering less from 2 specific clusters of healthcare disorders, which are coming up consistently across all of the different studies. So one cluster seems to relate to not being fed animal-sourced allergens, beef, pork, chicken, and so on. And the cluster of benefits seems to relate to lowered rates of gastrointestinal disorders, pruritic skin, and ear canal disorders. So some of those are going to have pretty significant impacts on quality of life. The second cluster of benefits seems to relate to a reduction in being overweight and obese, having musculoskeletal disorders, and mobility problems. And again, these likely impact quality of life. These two groups of benefits seem to be coming up across multiple studies. Here's the next study that came out that exemplifies some of this. This was published by veterinary nutritional specialist Mike Davies in the United Kingdom last year. He surveyed 100 guardians who had switched from a meat-based diet to one of the new vegan dog foods being produced by veterinarians here in the United Kingdom. And after at least 3 months on these new diets, Davies found a whole group of benefits relating to skin condition and ear canals, another group relating to gastrointestinal tract, and then a third group of benefits relating to behavior. So I don't know why the behavioral ones seem to be occurring, but as I've said, the other two benefits seem to be coming up in other studies as well. Collectively, there are now 10 studies or veterinary student master's theses which have examined health outcomes in dogs maintained on vegetarian or vegan diets. I'll come back to this slide, but just to show you what it looks like, if you go to sustainablepetfood.info, that's my site, and you click on the health tab, you'll get a brief summary of all of these studies with a link where you can click through to the full study, and most of them are available open access. There's also one systematic review that's examined health outcomes in both dogs and cats. Now, out of those 10 studies, and which include 2 veterinary student master's theses, 9 out of 10 support the use of these diets. They show equivalent or superior health outcomes when vegetarian and vegan diets are used. The sole exception is the oldest, smallest study with the least realistic study conditions. So the weight of evidence clearly overwhelmingly supports the use of nutritionally sound vegan dog food. What about cats? This is the next study that we published, which looked at more than 1,300 cats on simply meat-based or vegan diets. We looked at the same 7 general indicators of illness and the 22 most common health disorders in cats, and 18 of the 22 were the same as for the dogs, but 4 of them were different. The percentage of cats that were unwell in the dietary groups, as you can see, 42% of those fed meat and 37% of those fed vegan diets. The average number of cases of health disorder per unwell cat were higher for cats fed meat-based diets, as you can see there. We conducted, we created regression models, again, to control for differences in age, sex, neutering status, and this time also in primary location, to control for whether cats might have been going outdoors and hunting. So once we controlled for all of those, we looked at the odds reductions for cats fed vegan diets compared to those fed meat. And as you can see, the odds of these 7 general indicators of illness decreased in all 7 cases for cats fed vegan diets, but the differences weren't statistically significant because the 95% confidence intervals are crossing the dashed horizontal line, indicating the meat-fed cats. We went ahead again and calculated the specific risks of these general indicators of illness for cats with average characteristics, so average age, sex, neutering status, location, and so on. And then we calculated what the reductions of those risks were for cats fed vegan diets. And as you can see, the reductions varied from about 4% up to about 54%. The 22 most common health disorders in cats were different from those in dogs. The most common in cats were dental and oral conditions, body weight, gastrointestinal, and so on. And the probabilities of suffering from one of these 22 disorders was highest for 15 of them when cats were fed meat, and highest for 7 of them when cats were fed vegan diets. So it was clear from that study that the healthiest diets were nutritionally sound vegan diets. There was clearly a strong trend in this direction. That study was also published open access, also in the journal PLOS One. We choose that one because it's got the biggest general, it's the biggest reach of any general science journal in the world. And that's freely available on the internet as well. Again, if you click on my website, sustainablepetfood.info, on the health tab, you'll find 3 studies that have examined health outcomes in cats maintained on vegetarian or vegan diets. And it looks like this. A short summary of the studies, click through to the full study, and there's also a systematic review as well. Based on those 3 studies, as with dogs, the weight of evidence clearly supports the use of nutritionally sound vegan cat food. There are no contrary studies demonstrating contrary results. So if you want to have an evidence-informed position, it is one which is supportive of the use of vegan food for cats, providing it is formulated to be nutritionally sound. Here is the systematic review that was published very recently that looked at a larger group of studies, as well as the ones that I have mentioned, and health outcomes in both dogs and cats. And they noted that the beneficial findings were relatively consistent across multiple studies and shouldn't be disregarded, even though there are survey type studies which are being included, which ask people about their opinions. Of course, in the ones that we've conducted, we have asked people about their opinions, but we've also asked them about a range of much more objective data too, including simply, have they needed any kind of medication or not, yes or no? How many times did they need to see the vet? So some pretty quantitative data, and we also did our best to work out the veterinary healthcare assessments as well as the owner's own opinions. This is not really as accurate, despite our best efforts, as it would be to do direct laboratory analyses of blood and urine and clinical examinations. However, unfortunately, it's pretty expensive to do those things. And amongst this body of evidence that I've just mentioned, 10 studies in dogs and 3 in cats, there are some studies that have done those things. They tend to use 20, 30, or 40 animals because of the cost. They don't use 2,500 or more than 1,000, which is what we have done in the survey type studies. So the benefit of the really large scale studies is that you're able to get such a large amount of data that you can run really good statistical tests and tease out the differences between dietary groups. But of course, the disadvantage is that some of the data is more subjective. But as I said, there are also the veterinary clinical examinations and the blood and urine analyses included in some of the studies in this group. Now, I've been summarising the weight of evidence position of all of these studies with respect to dogs and also cats within the veterinary press in the United Kingdom recently, and this has been having some effects. One of the effects is this: the UK Pet Food Manufacturers Trade Association has recently updated their position at the start of this year to actually support the use of vegan pet foods, providing that these are formulated to be nutritionally sound. And the British Veterinary Association is also updating its position. For a long period of time, they have been parroting out the position that they have a blanket opposition to vegan pet food, which is obviously entirely ignorant of the published scientific evidence in this field. But because I've continued to point out that their position is outdated and contrary to the veterinary medical evidence in this area, they have set up a working group to examine alternative pet foods, vegan diets, other diets, feeding regimes, everything surrounding feeding companion animals. And I had the opportunity to present to them recently, and they're very interested in all the recent evidence in this area, particularly the environmental sustainability information. And they do intend to update their position on this issue in the new year, in a few months. So I think all of that pretty well satisfies the first concern that our surveyed pet guardians said that they had, concerns about pet health outcomes. For the next two, nutritional soundness and good quality of pet diets, I've only got one slide. We did another survey. We surveyed pet food manufacturers to see whether there were any systemic differences in steps taken to ensure nutritional soundness and quality of pet foods if they were producing vegan, vegetarian, or almost vegan diets compared to meat-based diets. And we asked them about the kind of expertise they were using. Were they working with veterinary nutritional specialists, PhD nutritionists, or other sources of expertise to design their diets? Did they formulate them to meet the nutritional guidelines of US or European authorities? Did they conduct feeding trials where animals are maintained usually in a laboratory on the diet as a sole nutrient intake source for at least 6 months? How did they ensure the quality of the ingredients? Did they rely upon paper agreements with their suppliers? Did they go and actually physically inspect the ingredient manufacturing plants? Did they supplement appropriately to ensure that all necessary nutrients are being included in these diets? What steps did they take to preserve the diets physically, whether it was use of steam, vacuum, cooling, etc.? Did they use chemical preservatives, antimicrobials, antifungals, colorants, flavorants? Were they monitoring for the degradation of fragile nutrients over time? And were they over-supplementing appropriately to account for loss of nutritional levels over time? And did they have good protocols for storage and shipping to retailers and onwards to consumers to try to preserve the nutritional soundness and quality of their diets? And after looking at all of this in great detail, it was clear that most companies were doing things pretty well at most stages throughout the design, production, and storage and shipping of these diets. The ones producing the plant-based diets were actually slightly superior overall to those producing the meat-based diets. Although diets in all dietary groups have sometimes been found to be nutritionally deficient, and indeed this has been true of more meat-based diets than plant-based diets overall. Anyway, so that was the overall result, and we wondered why that might be, and we thought that it's probably because the plant-based diets are newer and more controversial, and the manufacturers are aware of that clearly and are probably going the extra mile to try to ensure that their diets are generally being appropriately supplemented and produced to good standards. So that was the second and third concern that the surveyed guardians said that they had. Now, with respect to the fourth concern, palatability, there is an oft stated concern that it might be cruel to feed these carnivorous animals vegan diets and to deny them meat. In rebuttal to that point, Jed Gillen, in his wonderful book Obligate Carnivore, has this particularly amusing paragraph. I'm going to read it out to you. He says, "Try this experiment. Skip your cat's breakfast one morning and bring him or her to the beach instead. Driven by hunger, what natural instincts might kick in? What are the chances that your cat will splash into the water, swim 50 or so miles out into the deep ocean, and thereby engage a 1,200-pound animal, because an adult tuna can be as large as a horse, in an underwater battle to the death in order to fulfill the natural feline diet of fish? The idea that fish is a natural food for cats is absurd. They're descended from desert creatures and are notoriously hydrophobic. Have you ever given your cat a bath?" So clearly he's making the point that cats have the ability to enjoy ingredients that are entirely unnatural to them. Those who claim that it is cruel to feed cats vegan diets would do well, I think, from having a look at the actual ingredients that are included in commercial meat-based diets that are most commonly fed to cats and dogs today. They do comprise a variety of body parts from a range of species that these animals would never naturally consume, with a variety of unnatural additives packaged up as dry kibble or wet diets and fed at predictable times daily. So this is actually a very unnatural feeding regime. We're also those same people are usually also entirely prepared to vaccinate, deworm, deflea, desex, confine indoors at night and microchip their pets and dogs, and do various unnatural things to safeguard their health. But they have a very big reaction to the idea of feeding a plant-based diet, which hopefully is nutritionally sound, because it is unnatural. Nevertheless, some humans do strongly feel that it's cruel to feed dogs and cats plant-based diets. I think more helpful than people arguing between themselves about this issue is to actually ask the cats and dogs what they think about this issue. How do we do that? Of course, we do it by studying their behavior at feeding time through palatability studies. So we did this. We looked at more than 2,300 dogs. So this is by far the largest scale palatability study that's been published. Fed these three main dietary groups: conventional meat, raw meat, and vegan. First thing we did was we looked at every indicator of palatability that had been described to date in the scientific literature, and some others that we predicted from my veterinary experience as well. We did a similar thing with cats. We had more than 1,100 cats on also these three different dietary groups. And for cats, there were 15 indicators of palatability. The first thing we did, we asked all the guardians when animals were eating their normal meals, how likely they were to display these various different behaviors. And then we did two steps statistically. The first was we looked at how much which of these behaviors would co-vary consistently with one another. And once we'd done that, we were able to identify some as positive indicators of palatability, some as negative indicators of palatability, and some and a small number as indeterminate. We looked at the extent to which they co-varied with one another and also compared results to previous published scientific studies of palatability. And there have been a number of those, much, much smaller than ours, but nevertheless, there is some useful existing data. So once we'd identified some as being positive and some as being negative indicators of palatability, we then looked to see whether dogs fed conventional meat versus raw meat versus vegan diets were more likely to display positive or negative indicators, and the same with the cats. Across the board, there was virtually no differences between the dietary groups, some very small differences. For example, dogs fed raw meat seemed to enjoy their diet slightly more than those fed conventional meat. But overall, there was no significant difference, certainly for dogs and cats fed vegan diets compared to those fed the other two dietary groups. This was also the result of the other published studies into palatability. So there's actually no evidence for the claim that it's cruel to feed dogs and cats vegan diets. Of course, animals may develop preferences for the foods that they've been maintained on long term, particularly due to the additives which are included in those diets, commercial additives. But on average, the evidence indicates that dogs and cats enjoy vegan pet food just as much as those that are based on meat. So the final interesting concern that the surveyed pet guardians said that they had was about environmental sustainability. And this is where it gets even more exciting, I think. We know that the food system overall has the livestock sector overall has enormous environmental impacts. You know, the food system is responsible for about a third of greenhouse gas emissions globally. It was reported in Nature Food Journal that the livestock sector is responsible for 20% of greenhouse gas emissions. That was reported in 2020. Since then, there have been other studies which have updated this. The livestock sector appears to be responsible for about 25 to 30% of all human-generated greenhouse gases. So it is one of the top sources of all greenhouse gases. There was a key study by Ocken at the University of California, Berkeley, published in 2017, that indicated that in the United States, at least a quarter of all livestock sector emissions, possibly up to 30%, but at least a quarter, are due to pet food. If we use just a quarter and we use just the 20% figure published in Nature Food in 2020, then pet food would be responsible for 5% of all human-generated greenhouse gas emissions. But and by the way, this is quite shocking because it's previously been calculated that the entire transportation sector, so that is all the planes, trucks, buses, cars in the world, are responsible for about 13.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And we know that there are armies of people working on sustainable transportation systems. Now, we have a sector that may be responsible for 5%, potentially something like 30 to 40% of the transportation sector emissions. Are there armies of people working on that? No, the number of people working on that is myself when I've got time. Ocken at University of California, Berkeley, who published one study, arguably manufacturers who are producing vegan pet foods, and that's pretty much it worldwide. So this is probably the most neglected, potentially impactful sector of the entire plant-based food movement. What I wanted to do in my most recent study was look at how many greenhouse gases would actually be saved if the world's dogs and cats transition onto nutritionally sound vegan diets, how much land, water, and other savings would be made, how many food animals would no longer be slaughtered each year, and by the way, how many additional people could you feed with the food energy saved? Because we know that, as Ocken calculated in his study, for every 4.7 joules of plant-based energy that goes into food production through the livestock sector, you get 1 joule of consumable energy out. You lose most of the energy in the conversion because most of it doesn't directly produce usable meat, milk, and eggs. It simply supports the maintenance of livestock animals. So it's mostly lost in conversion. If we were to consume that energy directly in the beginning of the process, we could feed so many more people. So I wanted to calculate how many extra people could you feed. It wasn't really possible to do a study like this until very recently, and something exciting happened in 2020. A study was produced for the first time that actually analyzed the ingredients that went into pet food on a large scale. And it occurred in the US, and it covered 2/3 of the entire US pet food market. It listed all the ingredients and the species of animals and the tonnages. So this enabled detailed analysis for the first time of the environmental impacts of pet food in the US. So that's what I focused on in my study. I used previously published indicators of the environmental impacts of all of the different types of ingredients to calculate what the impacts would be for a conventional meat-based diet versus a vegan diet. I did this for the US in 2020, and I also wanted to extrapolate the results globally, but there were not reliable figures for the populations of dogs and cats globally in 2020. There were for 2018. So globally, I used the 2018 numbers. And what I found was that livestock animals aren't all consumed in human food. In a wealthy nation with high pet ownership, such as the US, at least 20% of livestock animals are actually consumed within pet food, probably significantly more. Globally, it's more like 9% within pet food. That equated to, in 2018 globally, there were 78 billion land animals killed for food each year, would now be well above 80 billion. Of those, about 7 billion were consumed by dogs and cats, mostly by dogs, as you can see. If all the world's dogs, cats, and humans were to transition onto nutritionally sound vegan diets, then you can see the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that would be spared here. For the world's owned cats, not counting stray cats who are fed by cat colony carers and so on, not counting free roaming dogs that are all community owned, just the owned ones. If all the world's owned cats were transitioned, you'd spare more greenhouse gases than produced by the entire country of New Zealand. If all the dogs were transitioned, more greenhouse gases than all of the UK. And if all the humans transition, more greenhouse gases than produced by the entire EU. There'll be vast savings of land. All the humans transition, you'd spare land larger than Russia, which is the world's biggest country, combined with India. There'll be vast savings of freshwater, exceeding all renewable freshwater in various regions of the world. And the number of additional people you could feed is massive. If all the cats transition, you could feed the entire United Kingdom, that is the human population of the UK, and more. If all the dogs transition, you could feed 450 million additional people, more than the entire population of the EU. And if all the humans transition, you could feed at least 2/3 of the current population of the Earth. My study had a choice at several steps of using a range of figures, and every time I did this, I picked the most conservative possible end of the range. And other studies have estimated that you could actually double the number of people, double the human population of the Earth. But I estimated you could feed another 2/3 of the current population. So my results are very conservative. The true benefits of nutritionally sound vegan diets in all three of these dietary groups probably be significantly larger than I calculated in my study. That has been also published open access in PLOS One. It's a very complicated study, but if you click on the comments tab, you'll find the simple infographic that I just ran through there, which give the key results. Since then, with some co-authors, I've also published a systematic review looking at all strategies for combating climate change that have been published in scientific literature in the last 20 years. And we've concluded after doing that, although many areas are important, the food system has a disproportionate impact and potential, and it's a major focus of our study. Once again, demonstrating we need to drop our consumption of livestock products to address the challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss. So those are the top concerns that consumers said they had before they'd realistically be willing to switch. Now, the pet food sector has been valued at $14 billion, as I said, for just dog food, going up to $26 billion within 10 years. This valuation, you must consider that almost all of the pet-owning world is not aware of all of this research that I've just told you about, because it's just happened, some of it in the last couple of months, nearly all of it in the last 2 or 3 years. So I think once the pet owning world becomes aware of all of this, this curve is going to skyrocket so much more quickly. A couple of closing words. It's extremely important in our advice to pet guardians that we emphasize it's not okay to just go home and attempt to make their own vegan diets, even when supplemented, because there have been quite a few studies showing that it's really hard to get this right, even when following recipes. And such diets are unfortunately often nutritionally unsound. So it's important, I think, that people try to purchase a diet produced by a reputable manufacturer. It should say somewhere on the labeling that it's nutritionally complete or complete and balanced, and it's not intended just as a treat or a snack. It should be produced by a reputable company, hopefully working with veterinary nutritionists or other experts to ensure that the diet's nutritionally sound. The company should be able to provide some kind of information about steps taken to ensure nutritional soundness and quality. The gold standard would be independent laboratory analysis confirming nutritional content. The cost of doing this usually exceeds the cost of producing a batch of pet food, so it's rarely done, but it is occasionally done. But the company should be able to provide some kind of information about steps taken. If a company can't provide any such information, won't answer inquiries, I recommend that people go elsewhere. I do have a list of suppliers on my website, sustainablepetfood.info. I don't receive any funding for that. I don't have a lot of time for that. Nobody pays to be on that list. So it's not fully up to date, but it is a good starting point, listing a whole lot of suppliers of these products. Secondarily, I think it's important that with any dietary change, we consider gradual changes. Some dogs in particular have a reputation for eating first and asking questions later. Regardless, you'll give the gastrointestinal bacteria and digestive enzymes a greater chance to transition to the new diet, plant-based or otherwise, if you try to make changes gradually over 2 weeks. Some old fussy cats have a reputation for being very difficult to transition. I would not lose hope if even after 6 months of gradual transition, you haven't managed to fully get your cat onto a new diet. Even a partial transition is going to have potentially substantial environmental impacts and perhaps some health benefits as well. There are various tricks involved in encouraging pets to eat new diets, and they're listed on my website, sustainablepetfood.info, under the summary article there. So for anyone that, I would like to acknowledge my co-authors of my various studies. Most of those are statisticians. Some of the people that have helped me to get the funding to be able to do this research that have included ProVeg International, Food Awareness Organisation, some pet food companies. However, none of these sponsors have done anything that played any role in anything that might have altered the results in any way. But the research couldn't have occurred had they not provided the funding to allow it to go ahead. I basically used it to hire assistants at the university to free me up from doing marking and running my courses, meaning that I could do this instead. I also don't know 4,000 people on social media, and I'm grateful to all the volunteers and digital marketing companies who helped me to reach more than 4,000 pet guardians and conduct the largest survey of them that's been done so far. Again, my website is here, sustainablepetfood.info. If you click on the health tab, you'll find the health studies there. And some of the other studies I mentioned, I haven't had time to put up here yet, but you can find them on my own website, which is andrewknight.info. So thank you very much. I'm open to questions now. And I see there's been an awful lot of chat going on, which sadly I've had no time to look at yet. Do we have anyone to moderate this, or should I just start scrolling through the chat, or should people ask questions?
So the first one was, sorry. So are there vegan diets on the market that are suitable for dogs and or cats with kidney failure? Is important is it important that those diets are low in plant protein? Yeah, because usually they have very low plant protein levels. It's a long question, but
Okay.
is there anything?
In general, unfortunately, there aren't prescription diets for most medical conditions. There do seem to be for skin conditions, for food intolerances. And indeed, the first vegan diets seem to have been developed not because of any concern about environmental sustainability or animal welfare or ethics, but to provide novel sources of protein for animals that seem to be having dietary insensitivities and having pruritus as a result, particularly dogs. So novel sources of protein were found, and some of those happen to be vegan. So there are certainly vegan diets available as in hypoallergenic diets to try to treat pruritic conditions, but in general, not for any other conditions. So I would say for anyone that's dealing with kidney disease, to use the general principles of treatment of kidney disease and simply check the whatever diet you're considering feeding against the general principles necessary, including the vegan diets. But sadly, there aren't yet diets that have been designed to treat most conditions which are vegan diets. Hopefully they will come in the future.
Yeah.
Could I say there is something in there in the chat? I'm just sort of seeing, I'm sort of towards the start of the chat about urinary alkalinization and the risk of crystals forming, urolithiasis, and so on vegan diets. That was an early concern, actually. Feline lower urinary tract disease, narrowest urethras tend to be male cats, and there was a concern that vegan diets be alkalinizing and would increase the risk of urolithiasis because of crystals forming in the urine and so on. That was based upon reports of cases on websites and in books where this had supposedly occurred, and the advice was to monitor urine acidity and potentially acidify the urine if it seemed to be becoming more alkaline. However, since then, there have been very large-scale studies, including by Dodd and colleagues and myself, and we actually haven't found any rates of increase of lower urinary tract disease in dogs or cats fed vegan diets. So yes, there were a few reported cases, but once you do very large-scale studies, you don't find any increased risk. So that early concern seems to have been unfounded. There seems to be no need to be monitoring for urinary acidity.
Okay. And then the next question is about wheat-free diets and heart problems. Should we advise vegan pet brand foods with wheat, and also what do you feed your own pet if you have one?
I would love to grab my own pet and hold him up. He's actually a small fluffy gremlin with purple ears, which we were given by a friend of ours. Sadly, I have no real cats and dogs. I live in a small high-rise flat in the United Kingdom, and being a veterinarian, I'm not a great pet owner because my working hours are too long and I travel too much. So I don't have any real ones, sadly. And the question about wheat and heart, certainly I can talk about heart. So the large-scale studies by Dodd and myself and Davies, and indeed anyone that's done these studies, has found no increase in occurrences of prevalence of any cardiac conditions in animals fed vegan diets compared to those fed meat. So it just doesn't seem to be a concern. Wheat, I don't know what to say about that. I can perhaps say one important thing on this point, though, that commercial meat-based pet foods, what I found in my massive study looking at the actual ingredients and tonnages used within pet foods in the United States, was that commercial meat-based pet foods are nearly 50% plant material. And along with supplements, because many of the naturally occurring nutrients are degraded by high temperatures and pressures during processing, need to be supplemented afterwards. And of course, they have meat in them too. But the plant-based materials in the meat-based diets tend to be cereals, grains, vegetables, a variety of plant-based materials. So vegan pet foods are all of the same things in meat-based diets, but without the meat. So they also include a variety of plant-based ingredients, supplements. Yeah, so I don't know if there's any particular difference with respect to wheat in vegan versus conventional meat-based pet foods. I would expect them to be found in both, probably. Yeah.
Okay. The next question is, how many hours of nutritional studies do veterinarians receive during their education? And what effective ways to advocate for yourself as a companion animal guardian with a veterinarian who is not supportive of plant-based dog food?
Yeah. It's sort of commonly stated that veterinarians receive very few hours of nutritional education. Of course, this is going to vary with veterinary schools. When I was a veterinary student, we did have a module on nutritional biochemistry. It was in second year of a 5-year course in Australia. Our veterinary nutritional specialist clearly stated to the class that, of course, dogs and cats could be fed vegan diets, but they needed to be nutritionally sound, so fully supplemented. Everyone, I think, pretty quickly sort of forgot that and went with their own prejudices again afterwards, but that's what he told us. So the trouble with anything that's in second year of a 5-year course is you tend to forget most of it, really. What is really important for veterinarians is the final clinical year, when they're immersed in a world of animal disease and treatment protocols and diagnostic protocols and so on. The next part of a question, what do you do to educate a veterinarian? Well, in an ideal world, you could walk into your vet clinic with these studies printed out in full. The reality is that most veterinarians are not going to have the time to look at them. If you're lucky, they might have the time to look at the study abstract, which is the very long paragraph summarizing the whole study, which is on the front page. So it can be worth going onto this website, sustainablepetfood.info, clicking on the health tab, finding some of the key studies and just printing out the front page with the abstract. That might work. Another thing that might work is going to my own website, andrewknight.info, click on articles, and you'll find pet food. And you'll find the summary letters of multiple studies that I've published in Veterinary Times in the United Kingdom. Anytime I do that, it becomes out of date, unfortunately, or anytime I give a presentation like this, it becomes out of date really fast because there are so many new studies being published in this area. And those ones were published some months ago, so they're already out of date. There seem to be more studies showing that vegan pet food is well digestible, the animals have good health outcomes on them, and there are environmental sustainability benefits. These are coming out so often now. But nevertheless, even though they are out of date, they're good summaries of quite a large number of studies summarizing overall health outcomes in dogs and cats, and they're very short. A vet could read them in 5 minutes or less. So potentially you might have a chance with things that are very short. Vets don't usually have the time to read more than that. If your vet is not willing to consider any scientific evidence on this issue, and wants to stick with an existing prejudice against vegan pet food, I would definitely consider going to another veterinarian. It's one thing to sympathise with veterinarians, knowing that there's been a long history of unconventional diets, and often these have been formulated to be nutritionally unsound or made by pet guardians at home and are unsound, and animals have been harmed as a result. Vets know this, and so they're naturally suspicious of new diets. And nearly all of these studies have been published just in the last 2 or 3 years, and vets don't know they exist. So on the one hand, you can understand vets' skepticism and suspicion and have some sympathy for them. On the other hand, vets are supposed to be open to scientific evidence and supposed to be willing to update their positions when new evidence becomes available. If a vet is not willing to do that, that's when you should be going to another vet. And by the way, the evidence base supporting the use of vegan pet foods is now stronger, at least in the case of vegan dog food, is now stronger than exists for many other veterinary healthcare interventions which are well accepted. Mm. Most of them don't have 10 studies supporting them. Okay, so what's the next
question? Next question is, do you think it's possible to formulate a healthy vegan diet for an animal like a ferret?
The basic biological principles are the same for all species. Ferrets, dogs, cats, people don't need ingredients biologically. What they need is nutrients. And providing you formulate a diet using plant, mineral, and supplemental ingredients that might be synthetically sourced, providing you formulate a diet that supplies all the nutrients necessary and in the right balance, then it's not going to be nutritionally unsound. The next two things that you need is the diet needs to be adequately digestible, so it can be digested, taken up, circulated around the body, pass through into the cells and be utilized. There are no studies that have looked at all ingredients used in commercial meat-based foods and vegan diets, but there are a number of studies that have come out recently which have shown that the digestibility of vegan pet foods is equivalent and in some cases better than the digestibility of meat-based pet foods. So that doesn't seem to be a concern. We also know that the most important thing is the actual outcome in the animal. If you see an animal becoming incredibly thin and expiring, then yes, maybe it didn't manage to absorb any of its nutrition, but actually we're seeing the animals are doing really well. So digestibility is not an issue. And then the third issue is palatability. And do the animals enjoy it? Are they willing to eat the food? And you can clearly see from the palatability studies, including the ones I've summarized, that that's not an issue either. That's it. There aren't any other biological concerns. So in theory, you could formulate a diet that was vegan to feed ferrets or any other species, providing those three things are taken care of: nutritional soundness, digestibility, and palatability as well.
And similarly, this might have been touched on actually, but the next question was, is there evidence of a reduction of GI issues or histamine reactions in a vegan dog food diet?
Well, yes, the study that I summarised by Davies, the veterinary nutritionist in the United Kingdom, that was published last year, which is also available open access, and also you can find from the health tab under sustainablepetfood.info. That showed a range of gastrointestinal benefits associated with the vegan pet food. And again, that was a pet food that was created by United Kingdom veterinarians. There are a number of them, small number, that have created new vegan pet food products. And that's what they found. The low rates of gastrointestinal problems, a wide group of those. I don't know about histamine reactions in particular. I mean, Davies provides a lot of insightful and advanced information about what the underlying mechanisms might be that could be causing some of the various benefits that have been seen. I don't recall that he mentioned that. It would be worth going through his study, whoever asked that question, to see what he's written about those outcomes and what might be the mechanisms underlying those.
So there's a question from about 40 minutes ago. So I think it was specific to something that was on a slide. But it says, it'd be interesting to see what raw food diets were fed. Were they pre-formulated and a board-certified veterinarian nutritionist was worked with? Are there feeding recommendations of a veterinarian well-versed? So I think it was specific to something on a slide for the raw diet.
Okay.
I don't know if anything
Yeah,
to
it,
say?
it would be interesting. I had a very comprehensive survey that I asked the more than 4,000 pet guardians to fill out. We didn't just ask about health outcomes and behavioural outcomes. We also asked about where people were getting their information from, where they're using recipes, where they were getting ingredients from, diets from, feeding regimes, exercise levels, and various other bits of useful information. And I'm going to analyze that and publish it in due course. So watch this space. Whenever I publish something new, it goes onto my LinkedIn and my Facebook as well, and will appear on my websites in time. We don't have specific information about the ingredients that were people were that were going into the main diets that they were feeding. We did have a lot of information about whether they were supplementing or supplying any additional treats, snacks, additives, what kind of additives they were, but I don't have the details of what raw diets might have been and what the specific ingredients of those might have been.
And that's very similar to the next question, so I'll skip to one part of it. Could you comment on synthetic taurine bioavailability?
Yeah, sure. So there were a series of studies done, I think, in the 1970s, finding that cats fed commercial meat-based diets were suffering basically from taurine deficiency. So they were taurine deficient. Taurine is an essential amino acid that cats need. They can't manufacture it from others. And if they don't get it, eventually they will suffer the degradation of the retina in the eye, and they'll lose their sight. They can also have cardiac problems. They can also have birth defects. And it was found that cats were suffering from these problems, and it was explored and found that actually the naturally occurring taurine in meat in cat food was being degraded by the high temperatures, pressures, chemical treatments involved in the processing of meat-based pet food. Those sorts of treatments tend to degrade fragile nutrients, so they can unravel amino acids, building blocks of proteins. They can damage vitamins. They're probably not going to damage minerals. They're probably not going to alter overall protein and carbohydrate and fat content. But the more fragile nutrients, they have the potential to degrade significantly. So this problem was overcome by, once the processing was finished, taurine was added back into the cat food, and that was a synthetic source of taurine. It wasn't naturally occurring taurine, but it did the job perfectly, and the problems went away. So vegan pet foods are supplemented with the same synthetic source of taurine that meat-based pet foods are supplemented with, because if the meat-based pet foods don't have them, then, and they go through normal processing, then this is what happens. Most of the taurine gets degraded and animals suffer taurine deficiency.
And are there any studies that compare benefits of dry kibble versus canned/fresh vegan diets?
No, there aren't. Very simplistically speaking, the important thing is the animal receives the right amount of calories and all the nutrients that it requires. This can be achieved on either a wet or a dry diet. Dry diets tend to be much more concentrated. Wet diets have a high proportion of water. They're effective for filling up the stomach, but may have a lot less calories than a dry diet. The most appropriate diet for a particular animal might depend upon what's going on with that particular animal. Animals that have any kind of lower urinary tract condition, it may be wise to flush as much water through their system as possible. So wet diets may be beneficial for that. If an animal needs to lose weight, again, wet diets may be beneficial because they can fill up the stomach more but provide less calories. Perhaps if an animal has a lot of buildup of plaque and tartar on its teeth, sometimes dry diets are thought to be more effective at scraping the teeth clean, although dental chews would be better still, and pet toothpaste even more so. But yeah, so it depends, what other conditions might be going on with the animal. It is not the case that wet or dry diets are more likely to be nutritionally sound, and that animals, can get the right amount of calories more regularly on one diet versus another diet.
And the next question, I feel like a bit of this we touched on, so I'll skim through it. But they were saying that they used to feed their dog a vegan diet. The pH of the urine was like too high, and there was crystals in the urine, so they turned to normal after adding some meat-based food in the diet. Does this mean that vegan diet is not suitable for that dog? And is there anything they could try if they wanted to feed her a vegan diet?
Yeah. Certainly isn't the case on average. When you do large-scale studies of thousands of animals, we know that there are not increased risks, and this doesn't occur on average. Of course, it can occur for specific animals. There's all sorts of anomalies that can occur for specific animals. If somebody has a dog where urinary alkalization is occurring on these diets, and in that particular dog it's a problem, then there are a range of dietary additives that can be added to acidify the urine. There are naturally occurring ones, and there are also veterinary prescription ones available. Naturally occurring ones are things like citruses and cranberries. There's also vitamin C in certain dosages, and there's also methionine pills that veterinarians can prescribe, which will acidify the urine more strongly than the naturally occurring products. I think some of these, it would be worth looking at my website, sustainablepetfood.info, under diets, under canine vegetarian diets, to see if there is still any information there. And obviously I should know the answer to that, but I'm so busy doing this research, I actually haven't had time to update my site for too long. So I'm not certain, but I can say that on average, there's no concern. If a particular dog does have a concern, then yeah, it is possible to acidify the urine using a variety of additives, depending on how serious the problem is. Monitor the acidity of the urine, the pH of the urine, using a litmus test strip, a paper strip, or better still, getting a sample and using electric pH meter for better accuracy, and to correct the problem. So it is possible to do that. I would say that simply feeding a meat-based diet is a pretty not a very accurate way to attempt to control the acidity of the urine. And if there was a dog that had those problems, I'd be wanting, if it was my dog, I'd be wanting to monitor a bit more closely and try to address the problem perhaps even more carefully than simply feeding a meat-based diet.
And then it looks like there's 2 more questions. Thank you for all your answers. This one is also about a dog. Can this dog be a dog that follows a vegan diet be a blood donor safely? If all the levels are good. That was the question.
I mean, absolutely. There's no concerns whatsoever about that. And you know, the only study that might be relevant, I think, was a study published in British Journal of Nutrition in 2009, which studied sprint racing Siberian Huskies. And there were dogs that were placed in 2 groups. 6 dogs were fed a vegetarian or vegan diet. I'm not sure which it was. 6 dogs were fed a meat-based diet. They went through 16 weeks of study, including 10 weeks of competitive racing, pulling sleds through snow for long distances. And it's hard to think of any greater exercise demands than this. Dogs in both groups had an increase in red blood cell count over time. So both groups displayed athletic adaptations to sustained exercise, as would occur in human athletes as well. Their red blood cell counts increased. But none of that's relevant. There was no difference between the dogs fed vegan or vegetarian diets and the meat-based diets. So no, there's no evidence to indicate there are any concerns with anything in the blood for dogs fed vegan diets.
And the last question that I see is, what steps do you think are important to create more jobs to work on this problem? National institution funding priorities so that people in academic can be involved, or are there other mechanisms that you have thought of?
There is massive concern about climate change nowadays and environmental sustainability, and there's no serious opposition anywhere to that being recognised as an important and concern, which is growing in importance. What my most recent environmental study has shown is that pet food needs to be a really substantial part of the discussion about the overall food system. there is wide recognition amongst the scientific community that current consumption levels of people are unsustainable, including with respect to livestock consumption. There need to be drastic cuts in livestock consumption if we're going to have a future on the planet that allows most forms of life to continue, because we are in a mass extinction event at the moment. Since I was born, the majority of wild animal populations on the planet have disappeared in my lifetime. So we need to clearly cut our consumption of livestock products. It is one of the biggest land users on the planet, freshwater users, and produces about 25 to 30% of greenhouse gases, which is resulting in us heading towards breaking the 1.5 degree and 2 degree and further limits of the increase in planetary surface temperature averages. So we need to recognize that no longer just means changing human diets. We actually need to be seriously looking at changing companion animal diets as well. So the evidence does exist now. It would be nice to have more of it, but we already have 10 studies now in dogs, which are the most important group. I think what's needed now is for this information to actually be communicated to the pet-owning world and to veterinarians. So I'm very grateful to have the chance to give this CE session tonight, to be able to do that. And it is night here in the UK at the moment. I know it's morning in the US. And also bodies such as the British Veterinary Association here and the other national veterinary associations and pet food manufacturers and any legislators. So I think what would be most helpful would actually be communication rather than further studies, but anyone that has any way that they could try to help make people who are decision makers aware that we need also to be looking at pet food, not just human dietary consumption. Please do what you can, because it's about the most neglected, potentially impactful area of the entire plant-based movement and environmental movement as well.
Well, thank you so much. I don't see any other questions in the chat. I don't know if there's anything you want to end us on, but it's been a great talk. So thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Just to emphasize that more work is coming. I'm a reviewer. I have reviewed studies that I know are coming. I've got further ones planned as well. For example, ones on economics. The reductions of risks of specific adverse outcomes when nutritionally sound vegan diets are fed result in cost savings. Medication is expensive, veterinary visits are expensive. If there are less of those on certain diets, that translates to economic benefits. There's going to be an economic study coming. There are other studies coming as well. So if you want to stay informed, as I say, I do post these on my own LinkedIn, Facebook. I'm very easy to find on the internet. And as soon as I get time, I will update them on my websites as well. But thank you very much, everyone, for your interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think that's it. Thanks for everyone for being here. And our next talk is, I think, in January actually scheduled. But if you are someone who would like to lead a talk like this, feel free to reach out to our honor on our website, or you can email us. And yeah, if you need anything, have any questions for Andrew Knight further, there's his website and all that there. So thank you.